It is really my greatest privilege and honor to help put this particular symposium together. And I'm really extremely thrilled to actually be able to introduce our esteemed speakers today. So let me start from Mary Jo. So Mary Jo, since January 2004, Mary Jo has been the Director of Government Affairs for the Population Association of America and the Association of Population Centers. In addition to representing the PAA and the APC, Mary Jo has also co-directed the Census project since 2008. Prior to her position with PAA and APC, she has worked at the NIH for about 10 years as the legislative officer at the NIA, the National Institute on Aging, and also as the special assistant to the director of the NIH Office of Policy of Extramural Research Administration. Mary Jo served as the legislative assistant for Congressman Rosa DeLauro and legislative correspondent for U.S. Senator Jeff Binkman. Mary Jo has also, she has a master's degree of public administration from George Washington University, and is a former presidential management fellow. She's the current president of the Association of Public Data Users, and she will talk about the policy context of the 2020 census. And as many of you probably have noticed, there's some legal challenges in the system right now that she's gonna hopefully touch upon. And let me move on to Professor Tom Lewis. So Tom is a professor of emeritus of biostatistics at our own school. And from 2018 to 2020, he served as an expert statistical consultant to the Center for Drug Evaluation Research at FDA. From 2013 to 2015, he served as the Associate Director for Research and Methodology and Chief Scientist at the US Census Bureau. His research covers Bayesian methods, development and application, clinical and field studies, health services research, environmental risk assessment, genomics, and survey methods. I don't know what else is left that's not mentioned here, that's public health. So he's an elected member of the International Statistical Institute, a fellow of the American Statistical Association, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and Institute of Mathematical Statistics. He's also a National Associate of the National Research Council. Tom is also, his current service actually includes, for example, serving as the associate editor of the Annual Review of Statistics and its application. Tom will provide preliminary discussions about the quality control and quality assurance of the 2020 census. And last but not the least, let me move on to Dr. V. Joe Hose. Joe is the Arts and Science Distinguished Professor of Economics at Duke University. His research includes economics of the family, economic demography, applied econometrics, and so on. His most recent work has focused on the role of families in the intergenerational transmission of economic attainment and the associated consequences of disparities in morbidity and mortality. Dr. Hose is also the principal investigator of, for example, the NIA-funded AdHealth study, which investigates intergenerational linkages in health and health behaviors, cognition, and financial and time transfers between parents and adult children. Joe is also the co-chair of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Committee on National Statistics Experts Group to advise the implementation of the new disclosure avoidance system for the 2020 census here. He also chairs the PAA Committee on Population Statistics. And Joe will actually discuss the differential privacy in the 2020 census today. So with no further ado, let me actually give the floor to Mary Jo.
Thanks, Lee, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this distinguished panel today. You've asked me to summarize some of the major policy events that affected the final stages of the 2020 census and lay the groundwork for the more technical issues that my distinguished colleagues will be addressing. I just wish to underscore for the audience that I'm presenting to you today in my capacity as a census stakeholder. So my perspective is really given from that of one who follows big picture census issues rather than as a data user or technical expert. Before I sort of launch into some of the challenges that the 2020 census faced, it's only fair that I focus on some of its more positive outcomes. So let's focus quickly on what went well in the course of the 2020 census, especially in those latter years. First, this was the nation's first digital census, one in which the internet was employed, and we had a lot of concerns as stakeholders about whether or not the system would work. It worked well, and there were no major security breaches. Also, this census made use of significant technology in the field, which proved to enhance the productivity of enumerators. Ultimately, the self-response rate for 2020 was almost the same as 2010. And I think the Census Bureau deserves a lot of praise for demonstrating agility and making significant changes during the course, particularly the last year in which the pandemic hit. They had to change operations. They also had to adapt their communications campaign very effectively in order to deal with the pandemic challenges. So prior to the years leading up to the 2020 census, an orderly plan had been publicized, and the 2020 census was on track to achieve major operational milestones according to a very thoughtful timeline that was consistent with previous decennial censuses. However, as has been the case with many recent censuses, the 2020 census experienced its own challenges, which forced the Bureau to rework its timeline even during some of its busiest phases. Now, the difference for the 2020 census is that whereas some of the censuses that occurred in the last century only faced maybe one major challenge, the 2020 census was confronted with multiple challenges, affecting everything from its resources, design, operations, and ultimately its outcomes. I would argue that these challenges came sort of in under three major headings. One, funding; two, the citizenship question and related fallout; and three, of course, the pandemic. First, with respect to funding, as this chart illustrates, funding for the 2020 census really began to drop off compared to other decennial cycles in year 7, which corresponds to fiscal year 2017. Some of this funding drop off, I think, can be attributed to the arrival of the new administration, the Trump administration at that time, that was really trying to cap overall domestic discretionary spending. But also Congress played a role, not only in that they controlled the purse strings, but they were also putting a lot of pressure on the Census Bureau to contain the costs of the 2020 census to no more than what was spent in 2010. As a result of this funding shortfall, or in response to the funding shortfall that the Bureau experienced, they had to pivot and make several changes to some very important tests that I think the consequences of which played out over the ensuing years. First, they had to cancel some very important field tests that were to be conducted in 2017, in which they had plans to test some enumeration strategies for hard to count populations in rural and remote regions. All of that had to be scrapped. They also canceled an internet self-response test that was to take place in Puerto Rico, and which was considered a multilingual area. Something stakeholders were very concerned about as well were the changes that were made to the 2018 census test as a result of funding shortfalls. Originally, as you may recall, that census test, which is also known as a dress rehearsal for the 2020 census, was to have taken place in 3 regions of the country: a rural, suburban, and urban area. And it was ultimately reduced to just one urban site, Providence. And also the Bureau had to forego testing some very important facets of the communications campaign and some outreach strategies. We were very concerned as stakeholders that also they weren't being given the opportunity to fully test the IT new capabilities that were being developed for the 2020 census, because again, Providence being a primarily urban area, not many mountains in Providence, we were concerned about how well this was going to play out. The second major challenge to the 2020 census was the Trump administration's plan to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census. Again, this was an issue in the 2018 dress rehearsal, and that the announcement that the administration made about their intention to add a citizenship question was not tested as part of the 2018 test. And this played out again over the year in which this slide summarizes. in which the civil rights community in particular, along with support from the data user community, including the PAA, fought efforts to put an untested citizenship question on the decennial census. Ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled against the Trump administration's plan to add a question, but that really didn't put to bed, if you will, the controversy that arose from this effort. The administration simply pivoted to plans to derive a citizenship number by ordering, through executive order, every federal department and agency to cooperate with the Commerce Department, which in turn delegated the effort to the Census Bureau, to develop a number representing citizens and non-citizens in the country. The Census Bureau tried to achieve this, began to work on this objective by trying to create a special census citizenship voting age special tabulation that would be based on 2020 census data. The third challenge that sort of plagued, and forgive me for using that word, the 2020 census was, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. Just as the 2020 census response was hitting its stride, national shutdowns compelled the Bureau to pause numerous operations, many of which are listed here. But the biggest impact really of the pandemic was its impact on the data collection, also the non-response follow-up phase of the census. It was on April 13th, 2020, that the then Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross and then Census Bureau Director Stephen Dillingham announced that due to the pandemic, they'd be delaying field operations and at the same time asking Congress to extend the statutory reporting deadlines for the apportionment data and the redistricting data by 120 days. Then in August, only a few months later, the administration reversed course, rescinding the request to extend the deadlines and also shortening the enumeration period from October 31st to September 30th. Now, the primary reason for this reversal was a realization on the part of the administration that the state population totals had to be delivered by the end of the calendar year in order for the Trump administration to influence ultimately the reapportionment process, particularly if the president were not to be reelected. It was over a period of really a month, less than a month, in which there was a flurry of activity in the courts in order to try to extend and stick to the original timeline that the administration had originally proposed to keep the field operations going through the end of October. Ultimately, though, again, involving the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the administration, and the Census Bureau brought all of its field operations and data collection efforts to an end on October 15th. The Bureau announced, though, that they declared victory in stating that 99.98% of all housing units and addresses were accounted for in the 2020 census. I think there was a lot of, media coverage of this issue. This sounded very impressive for data users. We had to say that this completion rate that they were promoting really didn't tell us anything about the quality and the accuracy of the data that were collected. We know now that a lot of these data that were collected during the non-response follow-up phase were collected through third parties. Also, we know that the completion rate didn't necessarily account for the millions of people who were living in group quarters who had been displaced because of the pandemic, such as college students, and also individuals who were living in transitory locations didn't necessarily get the same follow-up that they would have gotten had there not been an expedited field operation. Rushing the final critical phases of the 2020 census raised new problems as well. It was on November 19th that the Census Bureau publicly disclosed that the agency had discovered a number of processing anomalies. The anomalies are listed here. They were especially affected the group quarters data. Now, to be fair, anomalies are not unusual. The Bureau expects to find anomalies when they are processing the data, but that they usually, though, have enough time to review the records and make necessary corrections. And that simply wasn't going to be possible under the timeline that the Trump administration had laid out. So the Bureau pushed back, and it became a very public battle in which they said they would not be able to produce the population counts at a minimum until late January. So this announcement derailed an effort that the Trump administration had pursued sort of in concert with their efforts to add a citizenship question, in which they were trying to exclude undocumented immigrants from the apportionment base. Again, this slide sort of summarizes for you some of the major milestones that transpired between July and December of 2020 around this issue. Ultimately, the Supreme Court once again was invoked, and they rejected a challenge to the Trump plan, not really ruling on the merits of excluding undocumented immigrants, but rather on the lack of standing and the lack of good data that was going to enable them to make a decision about the implications of excluding undocumented immigrants. To help resolve at the very least the controversy surrounding the delivery of apportionment and redistricting data, Congress became engaged last year in introducing legislation, bipartisan legislation in both the House and the Senate, that would have officially extended the statutory reporting deadlines for the apportionment and redistricting data by 120 days, as the Trump administration had initially requested. Now, this bill didn't pass before the end of the last Congress, but we're expecting it to be reintroduced any day now. Now, census stakeholders feel this legislation is still necessary, primarily in order to provide certainty to policymakers and stakeholders alike to ensure that apportionment and redistricting data will be delivered by legally required deadlines. The legislation introduction and ultimately enactment, and we hope quick enactment, is necessary because of the recent lawsuits that have been filed, namely by the states of Ohio and Alabama, in which these states are attempting to extract the release of redistricting data before August, as the Census Bureau said is the earliest month in which they can provide any of the redistricting data. The Biden administration really ushered in a new era for the 2020 census. On his first day in office, the president signed an executive order stating that census population counts would reflect the total number of residents in each state, regardless of their immigration or citizenship status. And this signaled the end of work at the Census Bureau in developing the special tabulation of the CVAP file. Further, the Bureau was released from having to comply with the earlier deadline it had been imposed upon them, and said they would not be releasing apportionment data until the end of April. With the new administration, we also saw a change in leadership, both in the Commerce Department, which oversees the Census Bureau, with the arrival and ultimately confirmation of Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, former Rhode Island governor, as well as the retirement of Stephen Dillingham, who technically was eligible to stay till the end of 2021, but chose to retire, particularly when it became public that he had been pressuring, had been part of an effort, along with some political appointees in the Trump administration, to pressure career officials to produce a tally of undocumented immigrants based on the information the Bureau had up to that date by January 15th. Just yesterday, the Biden administration announced the president's intention to nominate Dr. Robert Santos, who is the vice president and chief methodologist at the Urban Institute, to be the next Census Bureau director. So the changes keep on coming. With respect to the delivery of apportionment data, I already mentioned that the administration did affirm they would be delivering by April 30th. The redistricting data continues to get a lot of attention in the press. The Bureau has said they can deliver the redistricting data in the legacy format file by August 2021, and then in the file that I think is of greater use to those who need those data by the end of September. So there are some remaining challenges facing the 2020 census, which my colleagues are really going to reflect further upon, those being namely, again, we are awaiting the delivery of apportionment data at the end of this month, the redistricting data this summer, and then, of course, unresolved issues that have continued to play out because of the lack of confidence, I think many people have in the outcome of the 2020 census and the data, and also new approaches to ensuring that the data can be kept confidential and secure. And it's to those issues that my colleagues Tom and Joe will address. And I believe now I'm to turn it over to Tom. Tom.
Is that viewable?
Perfect.
Okay. So what is quality? Well, what is beauty? What is truth? As a statistician, the only answer I can really give is it depends. There's no absolute. It depends on something that is the goal for the goal. So it might be better to be talking about fit for purpose than quality in an abstract sense. And there are configurations of the data as they relate to the true underlying numbers, which of course themselves are unknowable, for which quality will be high or low. For example, with apportionment, if the counts for the states are sufficiently far from a boundary that would change the apportionment numbers, they're perfectly appropriate for apportionment. So the issue there is shares of population and actual counts that are close enough to the underlying truth. For redistricting, it's a little more vague. The counts, demographic and geographic resolution, are they sufficiently accurate to comply with whatever legal and sort of other guidelines that might be available? Again, something that's not really knowable, but at least you can evaluate relations and see what's going on. And then there are a slew of other things that the census is used for, either on its own or with other information. Formula funds, allocation of federal funds, voting rights enforcement, government, private industry planning, you name it. And each of those, whether or not the census data are sufficiently high quality, will depend a bit on the application and on the usage. And of course, as Joe will talk about, privacy protection needs to be factored in because it does degrade the quality while hopefully upgrading privacy protection. The warning is that no decennial census is perfect, no survey is perfect. So it's all a question of degree of imperfection. Next slide. This is just a picture of a subset of the plans and the processes for response processing. Nothing having to do here with pre-census advertising or with the field work, and not even everything about processing. And the point is just to show how complicated it is. There are lots of moving parts, lots of interrelations. It's not surprising that it takes time, even in the best of circumstances, to deal with the collected data, let alone to collect it. Next slide. Mary Jo did a nice job of outlining things, and I'll just quickly go over this in terms of some of the reasons that 2020 was at elevated risk. Quality has always been an issue with the census. It's a heightened issue this time, and it's why a lot of actors, if you'd like, and actresses are involved. So there were tornadoes and hurricanes. There always are these things. But by moving the data field collection, especially for Louisiana, they were in the hurricane's eye. A good book, by the way. COVID, no real pre-planning for it, how could you? But an effective initial adaptation via the COVID plan. But there were a lot of pre and peri-census politics. I call it the failed sort of 2017 to 2019 attempt to include the citizenship question. Even though it wasn't allowed to be included, it colored the climate. And I'm sure there were many people that actually felt it was that it was on and would be very reluctant to even enter the census domain. The replan, quote unquote, truncated field work to September 30th and attempted to deliver the reapportionment values by the end of the calendar year. The Urban League suit and a few others wrested a little bit of an extension out of the field work eventually to October 15th, even though we couldn't get it all the way to October 30th. But the December 31st deadline was still there, at least in the official way. There were several political appointees, or three, I think, that were added to the Census Bureau, an unprecedented thing. They did nothing, even if they did nothing, it was causing trouble, but they did nothing but cause trouble. And then, as Mary Jo said, there was this non-citizen database, as it was called, or at least some labels, with the intention of subtraction a database that was essentially impossible to create with high quality in the time frame or even in any time frame, but was taking away from efforts. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. So the census did pretty well, thanks to dedicated, skilled professionals who really may have their own politics, but their eye was on the prize of doing a good census in the context of this aspect. The automation with iPhones especially saved the day, quality being the top priority, and I think it was for the career staff, meeting deadlines of lower priority, and now we have the redistricting that may have to decide on trading off quality versus deadlines. Thank goodness a new executive branch allowed a lot of things to happen and not happen that wouldn't have otherwise. And so you see the current deadlines that are presumably going to be met. The COVID plan for the redistricting was the 31st of August. And why would you think there had to be another 2 months delay since everything else was adjusted? And a lot of that reason is that in the attempt to get the December 31st numbers out for the apportionment, the Bureau had to actually not parallel process, but sort of completely focus on the statewide numbers, which reduced efficiency a great deal. Click again for, it's not next slide, but it's the next part of this. So challenges remain, and this is the PowerPoint. Unfortunately, it's not quite as well formulated as I'd like. But there were a lot of things that still give concerns on the collected data, let alone on how the processing can go. But it's obviously the case that you can't do much better than the quality of the data that you've collected, although the Bureau has lots of ways of improving it with some administrative records and imputation. Next slide. Try to go quickly. So the Bureau always does a good job of quality assessment and improvement. There are lots of things that you can go to the Census Bureau to find out a lot about those. And the reason this year I think that there's heightened attention to quality is the political climate and the challenges of COVID and everything else make it more important to have even more externality. And click again, I don't know what's really happened to this slide, but go back. Somehow a lot of the stuff I'll read some of the other things. There are a lot of actors, including the American Statistical Association's quality metrics task force and quality indicators, which will be independent. We'll come up with 2 reports. And if nothing else, and you can go to the next slide now since there's nothing there to read except that it got hidden. If you go to the website and look at this, if nothing else, it's got an excellent tutorial on the steps of census processing that are important. Next slide. Here you can see the membership. I'm not going to mention anything other than look at the upper right. That's Rob Santos, who will be nominated to be the new census director. We'll lose him on the task force, but we'll gain him in a lot of other ways. Next slide. So this task force will collaborate with the Bureau on database preparation. And in fact, dealing with that database is sufficiently challenging, maybe to the 5th power or maybe higher, that census staff who know the database will prepare analysis data sets for the 3 members of the group that will be the doers. There's a firewall between them and the other census operations so that independence can be maintained. The 3 ASA members will conduct analyses. The rest of the task force will eventually react to them, interact with them. And they must be cleared by the Bureau's Disclosure Review Board, but other than that, no vetting by the Census Bureau. And the analyses will include process kinds of indicators like enumeration rates at various small geographies and outcomes in terms of actual counts and so on and so forth. So if you look in the report, you'll see a lot of things: geographic variation in response type, comparisons of 2020 to 2010, and external population projections, outlier analysis, correlation analysis, and other analyses as they emerge. And a big point is that these will also have to undergo disclosure protection so that the fine grain that you might like to be able to display may not be able to be displayed. So click again. Hopefully the next thing appears. Yeah, and at least as important, and maybe dominant almost, is to come up with lessons for 2030. Next slide. And actually go to the next, just to be a little bit. These are two things from the report. This is a Bland-Altman plot of the relation between the 2020 and 2010 difference versus the average of those two. A plot that removes the inherent correlation in trying to do one versus the other. And you can see that there's a little trend of the lower the typical response rate for the two censuses, the lower 2020 was compared to 2010. I'm not claiming I know exactly what that means, but it's an indicator, not a metric that might be worth looking at. Next one is another similar one that's now 2020 internet self-response on the x-axis, the same difference on the y. And you can see again, the same kind of relation that may trigger some investigations. We didn't, for the preliminary report, have any of the spatial correlation plots and outlier analyses done, but those will be in the task force report. Next slide, I think last slide actually. So the census was conducted in an epidemiological, meteorological, sociological, and political manifestation of the perfect storm. I think that's absolutely true. The technology skills and commitment attenuated the negative effects. Post-processing continues, as does fit for purpose assessments. And you can see the list of things that hopefully we can learn from the 2020 experience to improve 2030. Trying to anticipate or at least be ready to deal with tail events like what happened with COVID. Improved real-time quality indicators will be very important. Improved communication of all sorts, and we hope improved protection from political inference and other threats to validity and credibility, such as the legislation that hopefully will work its way through Congress. And then one more click is it. It's the end. And thank you.
So I want to talk about differential privacy today in the 2020 census and its consequences for data quality. Let me just start by noting there are a lot of uses of the decennial census data from the legally mandated constitutional provision for apportionment of the House of Representatives to the, again, in statute, delivery of data to states and localities for the purposes of redistricting state legislatures and other governmental units. But it's also used historically for allocation of funds from federal programs, determination of population for Native Americans and other groups in the United States and reservations. It's even in part of many, built into state government. For example, the state of Nevada allocates resources based on population determined by the decennial census. There's, of course, a range of different research uses for the 2020 census and its companion, if you will, product, the American Community Survey. For the decennial census, one of the common things that's looked at is segregation patterns across the United States at fairly fine geography, calculations for the purposes of a lot of epidemiological work of using population counts as a way of determining calculation for mortality rates in the calculation of mortality rates and other health indicators. I think at least since the 1960s and 70s, the decennial census has been subject to attempts to do things to ensure the privacy of the information provided, more importantly, of the identity of individuals in the census, since in principle, this is an enumeration of everybody in the population. The concerns of those threats have been longstanding, and over time, the Census Bureau has done a number of different things to try to deal with that issue using different techniques. One I'll allude to later on is called swapping, which it interchanges pieces of information in the records and that are disseminated. Those threats have increased, and they've increased, if you sort of think about it, because of the availability of one online and commercial databases which allow you to match up information about, say, addresses, et cetera, with the information in the decennial census, and more powerful methods, algorithms developed in the computer science community for that can be exploited to use this data in combination with these databases to potentially identify individuals. Those new challenges were real. The Census Bureau over the past decade investigated the potential for using these kind of databases, taking the 2010 census, public release version of the 2010 census, which was subject to privacy or so-called disclosure avoidance systems. And they putatively identified 138 million or 45% of the population with that public release data set using these commercial databases, and quote, accurately re-identified 52 million or 17% of the US population with this strategy. So the Census Bureau is covered by privacy concerns. If you read its Title 13, it's a statement that it has an obligation to protect the confidentiality, privacy and confidentiality of information it collects. And so that resulted in this exercise, and other forces as well, resulted in an exercise of looking at new ways, new strategies to or a new disclosure avoidance system based on this particular case on differential privacy. So I'm now going to tell you a little bit about differential privacy. This is going to be a very quick tour through it. I'll provide the slides later on if people want to go through in more detail. And I note that I liberally borrowed slides from colleagues as well. So basically the idea of differential privacy operationally is to infuse noise into tabulations, what computer scientists call queries, that are started for the real data, but infuse noise into that data. The noise is infused in such a way as to provide a probabilistic bound on disclosure risks for individuals, their individual identity in the data that's released or that could be accessed through what are called query sets. Think of those as cross tabulations of the data for our purposes. And then the Census Bureau, that process has to do some additional things, and those additional things turn out to be an important part of the story. This is the formula that if you ever look at differential privacy, you'll see in every one of the studies, it's the formula that sort of characterizes that definition of privacy. I'm not going to go through sort of explaining all of this this notation, but the key point is really sort of the next slide, which is summarized from a paper by Jerry Ryder, my colleague at Duke, which is what differential privacy is trying to do is characterize both from the definition, a guarantee on the quote incremental use, incremental disclosure risk of participating in they're in the data, somebody in the data, given the risk associated with taking them out of the data, right? So the question here is sort of using the data on all these characteristics which are collected in this particular case, the census data. And the question is, can you sort of characterizing what if you left that person in versus out? Can you reduce the risk of using all that information to identify these individuals? And one puts a probabilistic bound on that risk. So privacy is not, though, there's really not an algorithmic control of disclosure. In fact, I'm going to show you how we go about sort of privatizing the data. It's not an absolute guarantee. This is a probabilistic statement about the guarantee. So this does not sort of guarantee, and there have been questions about whether this, the law requires an absolute guarantee. That's really not realistic, but putting a probabilistic bound. And the key that people, the advocates of differential privacy argue is that you can characterize what that probability is. Previous methods have been used, right? One, the previous that I showed up you on the earlier slides about this re-identification effort with the old previous methods largely used as swapping, did create sort of a non-trivial number of disclosure risks, but this isn't the whole idea here is based this on a mathematical proposition behind which, and a procedure, which I'm now going to describe briefly, but that you could characterize that probability. If you want to change the probability of disclosure risk, right, you can do so by adjusting the procedure. So here's a basic idea. Let's start with actual data. This is a data tabulation which shows micro level data, say collected in the census, the decennial census on sex and age. I'm going to do age groups here to make the diagram sort of simple. And this is a tabulation, say, done at some level of geography. pretty small because the example is pretty small. So this is just a representation of all the different combinations of age and age groups and sex that can be delineated, and just shows you the number of these X's, or the counts that are occurring of these different possibilities in the data. Well, you can think of that's just a contingency table, right? A cross tabulation of the data. Here's the cell counts, a total population of 100 in this particular case. This is the true data with the cell representations, the counts in each one of those cells by the different combinations of gender and age. So the idea of the differential privacy is you simply draw a noise and add to each one of those counts, as I'll show you on the next slide. You take a draw. These are independent draws. They're independent of the data, or sort of whether the cell had a small count or a large count. And the spread of that distribution determines sort of how much privacy you're giving up. If you think about it, if I put a really concentrated draws and adding these quote epsilons to the data, to these counts, right? I'm getting numbers really pretty close to the true values, but that creates a higher risk of using that data to be able to identify individuals. If I spread it out wide, well, I make I reduce that risk, but at the same time, right, I infuse a lot of noise into the data, and those counts from the infused data, noise-infused data, is going to be quite different than the true value. Okay, so this is just showing you that example, right? There are a couple of features I've noticed about this. What I've done is just taken arbitrary draws, added it to the original counts. Those are the ones in black, or the first number. In some cases, the noise was a negative value, so I subtracted it. In other cases, it added numbers. And this comes up with the new cell counts based on this noise-infused data. Notice one thing that's kind of important here: the total sum is different from the actual data, right? There are 108 individuals in this data, as represented by the noise-infused data, whereas there were only 100 in the previous slide. Okay, the whole premise of differential privacy is kind of this. The mechanism here: I add noise to these queries, that's these cross tabulations, I come up with a number, and the mathematical propositions about the protection of privacy associated with that data, and potentially the at least understanding the nature of the distortion, is pretty straightforward. And that's the allure of differential privacy from the perspective of being able to characterize. I can literally, the Census Bureau can publish the algorithms it uses to create the data that will disseminate. But it turns out that there's some little nagging, non-trivial problems associated with the use of differential privacy. First, as is illustrated in this example, I can get negative counts. I could draw large enough negative values as I've done here to actually get a count that's negative, right? So as you can see here in the cell for males under the age of 18, noise-infused data actually comes to a count of -2. This is a problem, to put it mildly, for the purposes of use of the census data. And so there has to be an extra step added to the use of differential privacy called post-processing, which adjusts, right, for these. And then I can't just put zeros in these cells when there's a negative count. They have to essentially come up with an adjustment using different types of algorithms to be able to get that. The second thing to note is, right, as I already recalled, the count here is 100, the total count, right, the total population for this locality is 108. In fact, the true population is 100. So if you were thinking about doing this at the state level, we would have apportionment, right, based on inaccurate counts of data. So what the Census Bureau has done is certain counts, like state totals, for example, are ones which have to be invariant. You have to impose that indeed only 100 people live in this locality rather than the noise-infused data count, which comes out to be 108. Both of those pieces and several more sort of create real problems for the algorithms that are used. It's not so simple. And the algorithm that's used, something called the top-down algorithm that the Census Bureau has been using, has to deal with these in so-called steps of post-processing. These post-processing adjustments sort of matter in the sense that, first of all, has been shown by recent work by two statisticians, Xiaoli Meng and Robin Gong, actually affect the privacy, these privacy probabilistic guarantees that are true of post-process, pardon me, are true of DP. So DP is not, so the pure DP, while it can make those guarantees, the post-processing steps to deal with these invariants and negative counts and several other factors can distort that. And they can and do create problems, in particular, not only variance, we knew that from the start, from the methods, but they also can create bias in counts and in other kind of stipulations. And I'm going to show you some of what we know about that. Okay, now the Census Bureau, to their credit, has done a number of things to try to, over the past several years, in particular since about October of 2019, to provide data, test data on the use of differential privacy and the use of these algorithms and how they are dealing with this post-processing issue using the 2010 data. So the comparison could be direct. You could simply compare the public release data version of the 2010 census already conducted, and compare it with a version of data that uses the algorithms that they were testing for the purposes using DP to test those outcomes. And they released several sets of data, data sets with that data, and in fact hosted a conference hosted by the Committee on National Population Statistics, of which I co-chaired with Joe Salvo, that brought together a bunch of different users in the user community to use their data and examine some of the properties of the data. That initial the slide sort of shows the various use cases and the point I just made. There was a similar exercise done with the 1940 census data. That's not quite the greatest test because the structure of the data, the units of geography were very different back then in 1940. But the benefit is you can actually use the true data, right? Because the statutes say that after 70 years, the identity of individuals in the data, in the census data, can be revealed. And so you could actually go back to the quote true data, not just the data that was used in this 2010 demonstration data in which there was noise infused information, and the public could look at those data sets. And there was a conference held at Harvard in the fall of 2019, which brought together a bunch of users to look at that particular data. Okay, so what I want to do now is sort of briefly sort of talk about the findings, and this finding sort of has a trail in the sense that it starts with this conference that I mentioned with the release of the first data set in October of 2019 that was analyzed and presented in a conference held in the December of 2019, so pretty tight timetable, that I co-chaired with Joe Salvo. What was found? Well, first of all, for many population counts at many levels of geography, for many geographic characteristics, the new DOS system based on DP with the post-processing done turned out to not have sort of serious consequences. That is, the accuracy relative to the 2010 public release data, they weren't all that, they weren't all that different. But that's only part of the story, right? There were concerns that the finer the geographic units you went to, census blocks, there was a serious problem. Something called off-spine geography, which I'll show you in the slide in just a second, were also affected. And certain population groups, especially those which were small in number in a location, so-called sparse cells, created a serious problem. What do I mean by off-spine geography? Well, the nation can be organized, and the Census Bureau organizes it, right? We have, the nation, regions of the country, divisions. These are designations for the Census Bureau. We start with states and counties, which are legal entities, and then the Census Bureau divides up counties into census tracts, block groups, and down at the bottom, blocks. The block is the smallest unit that's provided. That's all well and good, and that's a hierarchy, right? It's so-called on the spine, and you know where each unit sort of, if you start from the bottom, it pivots up as you aggregate up to these other units. But there are a lot of other units that are used of geographic units, which are, quote, not on the spine. If you think about it, right, school districts may cross a lot of different boundaries, especially census bounds. legislative districts, which is all the the subject of gerrymandering, right, and the redistricting processes which occur at the state level or finer geography, all can be some various combinations, and they can cross boundaries. And then there's an important set of considerations which are about looking at American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian areas, right, where there's high concentrations, including American Indian reservations, which may span a lot of these different areas and are separate units and have their separate statutory requirements of sort of tabulating information. Those off-spine issues were really the source of a big source of problem, in the sense that the detailed block level data, the finest geography on the spine, at the for this first pass of data was basically unusable. It simply was too inaccurate. That was true for even some census block groups and tracts, right? Especially think the western part of the United States, where in general they're sparsely populated. And there were these serious problems with miscounts in the miscounts for these off-spine, these localities, which are important for running things like, school district and doing forecasts for student body, the enrollments that are going to occur. Part of this whole, DP is characterizing what's called a privacy loss budget. I've glossed over this, but it's kind of determining the total over amount loss of data. But you've got to allocate that to different parts of the data, and they had serious problems with allocating that budget initially. Almost all of these problems were sort of traced to this post-processing problem, right? This issue that it's not just the pure noise, that there are issues with that as well, but the fact that these adjustments that had to be made in their algorithmic, the algorithm was used to sort of do this, created and exacerbated the problems, right? This invoking of, having to make sure the counts weren't negative and how you did that adjustment. And they led to not only variance, but bias, right? You tended to see that these groups were miscounted, right? Especially sort of small groups in localities. Oddly, as it turns out, in many cases, right, the small groups, those with sparse cells, actually were higher, systematically biased to be larger, the counts, than they actually were in the population, borrowing, if you will, from either groups which were more prevalent in the population, take non-Hispanic whites, and other fine geography. So the first episode, the first look at this data created some serious problems. And in a piece that Joe Salvo and I wrote, we sort of summarized some of these kind of findings. Census Bureau, to their credit, took this seriously, the exercise seriously, and went about trying to address the findings from this study. So the subsequent releases of the data, there have been now 3 more: May of 2020, September of 2020, November of 2020. And they all reflected different adjustments made to the algorithm trying to address these particular problems, also changing this privacy loss budget, allowing for higher probabilities of disclosure, but doing this and allocating it in different ways. And to be clear, there were many improvements that occurred in the data. That is, the counts in terms of comparisons of this, 2010 data with the versions of this noise infusement, with these different releases of noise infused versions of that data, improved in terms of the matching of quality of fine geography. There are a myriad of metrics which were disclosed, and the data was released so that user communities could go out and do the analysis themselves. Again, to the credit of the Bureau, they were fairly open and transparent about the process, and then gathering information back. Since then the pandemic hit, and then the political issues, which Mary Jo, has already talked about, hit, and this process sort of somewhat ground to a halt. It didn't stop the Census Bureau, and they've done a number of things since December of last year. So essentially over the last 4 or 5 months, which did a number of experiments. In which they tried changing the privacy loss budget. They changed the way that they were allocating this privacy loss budget across different units of geography, and across different so-called tabulations. That some of that information has been released. I must say that I've sat through 2-hour-long presentation in which it wasn't quite clear exactly what the heck they found. I think they're still absorbing what they found. But they're going to have to make decisions based on that information. The second thing that they did was trying to calibrate the algorithm that they used so that it met certain target criteria. And that target criteria was the following: going to populations as small as localities, geographic entities with populations at least 500 or more. So they conceded that it's going to be very difficult for geographic entities which are less than 500 people. But what they tried to do was what's called the 500, 5, 95, and that translates to for all areas which for areas which are at least have 500 people, that the largest demographic group was in 5 percentage points of the enumerated value for that particular group, for at least 95% of the geographic entities that were being considered. And the initial findings are that they did a pretty good job of meeting that criteria. Again, I've presentations, and I think those are now publicly available that sort of document that. But this is not going to satisfy many users. The most immediate use, which is for those who are doing redistricting, is going to create at least two concerns. First of all, much of the issue about redistricting, right, is centered around the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. That's to create districts in which there's a minority representation. And the concern then in redistricting has to be, you look at the racial, for protected minorities, composition of different possible configurations of redistricting areas. You're not interested in the largest demographic group. More often than not, you're quite frankly interested in the smaller demographic groups when you do those allocations. So this criteria here is not particularly satisfying. And there are other issues with respect to that particular criteria. But while a step forward, and that's an important part of this to be clear, Census has tried to deal with this and had some successes, but there are serious issues that remain. The last piece of this is, Mary Jo has already gone over this, or at least pieces of this. The one I want to draw attention to two of them. One is a couple of them. One is that they're going to release another demonstration product, this data of using noise infusion based on the latest versions of their algorithm applied to the 2010 data so you can do this comparison. That should be done by the end of the month and will be released. And it will be one last shot at providing users an opportunity to sort of assess the data, comment on it, because a key part is sometime in early June of 2021, the Census Data Stewardship Policy Committee, or DSEP, will set the parameters, will determine what the parameters are going to be for this algorithm and the use of DP, including what this privacy loss budget will be. It's going to do that right now for the redistricting data. This relates back to Mary Jo's chronology of the different release things, and the most immediate issue is after apportionment, which most of this won't affect because apportionment is going to be the actual numbers at the state level. The redistricting data has got to be released, as is indicated here, by they've committed to September 30th, and court cases are trying to move that much sooner in this particular case. Keynote and success, which Mary Jo has already indicated, citizenship or immigration status will not be included in these redistricting files that will be released. But there are other data products, and that I'll end on, right? There are other data products which people have used for these various other applications beyond the redistricting file, which doesn't show the full range of ages. It basically enumerate, sort of displays the information about 18 voting age versus non-voting age. So these files, now called the Demographic and Housing Characteristics file, or DHC data, is going to be released. That release has not been, to my knowledge, announced or committed to. And exactly what privacy or disclosure avoidance system will be used for that data has also been not committed to. It may be a variant of DP, which is most likely to be the case, but the question is sort of what variant will be. And the final one, right? Historically, the micro data has actually been released for tabulations, like for these computing of segregation indices that find geography, because it depends upon some of the raw data. There's an open question as to whether or not that data there will be a micro level file, and let alone when it will be released. Again, part of this is about the serious concerns about privacy and protecting that confidentiality. But it's also reflective of, sort of a serious concern in the user community about the data that will be available. Let me stop there.
Thanks so much, Joe and Tom and Mary Jo. So this has been super interesting. Unfortunately, we only have a couple minutes left. I don't know whether, anyone would be interested to either, unmute or maybe type the questions in the chat box.
Okay,
So that we
if
can.
people want to raise their Zoom hands or type questions, oh, that's not a Zoom hand, Stan, but I guess we'll let you use it anyway. It's your real hand. Stan, you need to unmute. Okay.
Thank you.
I haven't muted people.
So I had a question. I'm not sure who it's for. The New York Times had an editorial this week about the problem that arises from enumerating prisoners de facto. So many prisons are cited in rural areas, and it's districting in population sizes. So the urban areas that basically lose. What would it take to switch to de jure for prisoners?
This
So I
is
don't know
Tom.
who
I'll give a
wants
quick
to answer.
answer. I don't think there's a legal basis for us. It would take the Census Bureau changing its policy. And I think one of the concerns is that might cascade to changing all sorts of related policies. But Mary, you know something more.
Thank you. What is it for college students? It's de facto also still?
It's de facto there also, yes. That one's definitely, well, I don't know if there's logic to any of it. It's the current practice, I guess is the way to put it. So.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay, I don't know if everybody saw, but Emmy Hughes had asked a question of Tom in the chat about whether or not similar oversight had been done for previous censuses. And Tom, you just mentioned that there were a couple of ASA committees. I don't know if you want to expand on that.
Quickly, at least for the 2000 census, in terms of modeling and undercounting and so on, there were National Academy panels, the ASA had reviews and so on. 2010, there are probably some too, I can't come up with them automatically, but every census seems to have generated some activity for the statistical community, I might add.
Okay. And then I'm gonna throw in a question. I'm not sure who would answer this, but based on your presentation, thinking about the differences, a lot of this has to do with apportionment. But you mentioned that redistricting was going to be one of the first major activities affected by the differential privacy data. But I'm not sure why, and I'm not sure who should answer. Why is redistricting subject to differential privacy, since the data for redistricting goes only to congressional offices?
Well, but it doesn't, right? I mean, the key part of this whole thing is that data has to be public, right? Publicly released. If you think about it, right, anybody who's going to challenge a decision made by whatever state's method, whether it's their legislature or a commission, right, you have to have, transparency with respect to the data for others to be able to challenge it. So it does have there is a legitimate concern about the privacy.
Okay. And then Emmy brings up again in the chat another question. Do you want to ask it orally, or do you want me to read it for you?
I'll just say it out loud. Joe, thank you. Thank you, all of you, for all this interesting information. It's very helpful to have it all summarized. Joe, I'm a little confused about the implications of differential privacy for example, the kinds of crosstabs you can now do on census.gov and point estimates. I know that the PUMS is up in the air, the public use microdata sample, but is there going to be a deflation factor, or are we just going to have to look at relationships and not point estimates? I know that's a long answer probably, but give us a
well, I'll try to keep it short. So, let's take the data for the that's going to be used for redistricting, which is limited. It basically has age just in 2 cells, under 18, over 18. It classifies gender, and it classifies by a limited set of relative to what were collected. At least that's the current plan of characteristics about race and ethnicity for purposes of it enforcing the Census Bureau's claim of what is needed by the Department of Justice to enforce the Civil Rights Act. But all the other data, which I think you're alluding to, are tabulations that you can do. That's now called it's known as the demographic and housing characteristics file. Those data sets, that the tabulations that we publish, the cross tabulations that will be available on, sort of statistics.gov, right, will be census.gov, sorry, will be available, but it will be subject to differential privacy. They're going to apply it right to those all those queries for the different tabulations that you want. So they will be subject to this, right? The broader issue, let me just do this quickly. After the fact, Census does a lot of also additional special tabulations.
Right.
That creates a real problem for the enforcement of this budget, right? The privacy budget in terms of subsequent release. And how that's going to be handled, again, is another area of sort of very much an open question.
Okay.
And
Lingson,
I'll
you
add,
also
there will
have-
also be the access in the census data centers for those that have been vetted and are sworn to Title 13. Those analyses will still have to be reviewed for privacy concerns after they're conducted, but that's a very special access privilege.
And Lingson, did Joe answer your question?
I'm not sure. Joe, will the differential privacy will affect the cross-tab patterns to different degrees you mentioned? Right? Will Census Bureau inform these degrees to us, or we're just guessing?
Well, one of the things that's going to be, there will be disclosures of what are called error tabulations, which will provide information to users about the errors in the data that you can use for purposes of both understanding the statistics and possibly making adjustments. Exactly what form that will take, where you have to keep in mind, there are a number of sources of errors. Greater imputation presumably is going to be done because of all the reasons that both Mary Jo and Tom alluded to. And there's now this additional piece, which is the errors associated with the application of the disclosure avoidance, the differential privacy, which turns out to be a heck of a lot more complicated than simple saying of, what was the Laplace distribution characteristics that you use to infuse noise because of this post-processing step.
Right.
That's great. Do I have a follow-up question? Is between 2020 census and the previous census. So the previous census is using swapping the data, and now we're using DP. So how are we going to study the trend? How are we going to compare the different censuses?
That's a really good question, to which I don't know the answer. And at least to my knowledge, Census is not sort of indicated. There's a interesting paper in PNAS by a couple of authors, which shows the impact of this on these calculations of disease rates and mortality rates for different groups, and makes the case of arguing this is going to be a real problem to do the comparison to see, do we have an increasing or decreasing trend in various localities from various types of cancer rates or mortality rates. Think of deaths of despair in rural areas where there's sparsely populated cells. So yeah, the how they're going to do a bridge to deal with that is, to my knowledge, not resolved.
And I'll just add one point that it helps in the sense of being somewhat well calibrated, but it doesn't help in terms of findings. And that is, there's going to have to be a method to come up with additional uncertainty estimation for all of these computations that will make everybody very unhappy, I think, by the time they're done. But if they're honest standard errors in some sense, mostly the stochastic aspect of the differential privacy being brought in, it'll at least be I don't mean honest in the sense of not cheating, but honest in the sense of here's kind of the uncertainty in this correlation or the uncertainty in this finding, and it will be higher than you'd like it to be, I'm pretty sure.
So will the ASA take up the task and challenge and to develop some methods to deal with the huge challenges facing demographic researchers?
Well, I think there's going to be ASA and other, groups. I think there's going to be a lot of work that has to be done on this. The census acknowledges this fact that this, what I'll call an education process, right, is going to have to go on for the effective use of these data. I mean, they are committed. Well, I should be careful. They're not quite committed, but I think there's a high chance that they will disclose, a good deal this time about not only the past error, non-sampling errors that they've disclosed in the, sort of released in the past, but also about DP, because it's not actually, it turns out in general, it's not disclosive, but for this post-processing stuff makes that calculation a ton more difficult. So you'll get all that, but there's a huge issue about the education of users. That's from sophisticated researchers who kind of know a good deal about this, to think of people who are in localities who are trying to figure out what their population is. Localities in Nevada who are going to fight for the resources that are going to be allocated based on that noise infused data. They're going to have to know a fair amount about figure out or be educated about how to use this data to be able to deal with that non-trivial allocation of resources problem that they're going to face.
And we're also,
Okay.
oh, I just going to throw in the mix, and we're also trying to educate Congress so that they don't, we're walking a fine line there, so they don't engage and get involved and make this more complicated than it already is, but that they also understand the implications so they can follow and monitor effectively the kind of work that the Bureau is doing to address the concerns of data users.
And I'd
That's
like
actually,
to
I
add
just
that,
wanted, I know that we only have a couple of minutes left, but I did want to ask Mary Jo if you could speak to anything that's upcoming in terms of legislation that might affect the way in which census data is used, collected, or distributed, like the For the People Act or the, the new Voting Rights Act, whether there's anything on the horizon that you're aware of that actually directly addresses any of this.
No, I'm not. We're really myopically focused, I have to say, on this, the next introduction of the Census Deadlines Extensions Act. All of our efforts are focused on ensuring that that bill gets dropped and then enacted quickly because of the deadline, obviously, at the end of this month. And then through the appropriations process, some of these issues that you're talking about, Emily, may arise. But no, the focus, and now with Rob Santos's nomination, I think we have a lot of other diversions at the moment that we're trying to manage.
Okay.
so
That's
I'd
great.
like to make one quick comment
Yeah.
that is going back to the differential privacy, and interested in Joe's reaction, but the previous methods, the swapping, the cell suppression, and this and that, it's not like when you're done with that, you have these wonderful data that are just very accurate compared to the ground truth. It's a different system, and nobody really knows what the privacy protection is for it, although there have been a lot of studies of examples. But I think it's good to keep in mind that we're not talking ever about comparison to perfect. We're talking about other methods of protecting privacy. This may not be the best, but
no, I couldn't echo this more. I think it's a big issue, and it sounds like in the weeds, and but it's not, right? In the sense of we've been making decisions for a long time based on noisy data, right? All these different techniques, from cell suppression, swapping, means that we're not looking at the true data, and the consequences of that, I think, are not fully appreciated. It certainly was the case when the comparisons between the 2010 public release data that I alluded to with these differentially privatized versions of the data was always viewing that the first data set with the public release was ground truth, right? The gold standard. It's not. And this is a serious issue. Granted, we have just been talking about the release of information about error measures in that data, but this is a serious, serious matter. And when you have a constitution that says you're going to base it, right, like in Nevada, on allocating, resources, there's no, you kind of, I would think, need to sort of start questioning whether that's such a great idea, or at least without acknowledging the errors in the data. It's something I'm writing about now with, I think, some of the people on this call.
Thank you all. Lee, did you want to wrap things up? I'm afraid we've come to the end of the time for the seminar. There's so much to talk about, and we could spend a half a day on this. But unfortunately, we don't have the time. Lee, do you want to wrap up, or do you want to finish?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, just to say thank you again for everyone who made the time to join, and especially to the three panelists to make this great presentation. And fortunately, we have the recording for those who either were not able to make it or actually just had to leave earlier. They should hopefully be able to actually access some of the very rich discussions happened toward the end. So thanks again, and hopefully we can continue some of the discussions afterwards through emails or other venues. And hope everyone stay safe and get access to vaccines in the near future, if you haven't. All right, thanks again.